You are tuned to Kennett, Zenith Cablevision. Thank you for watching. It's time for talk. Each evening at this time, Monday through Friday, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. And now, it's time for Talk.
This program is a lot of work, and at times it is a genuine pleasure to do. And in doing a little background research for this program tonight, I met a most interesting gentleman whom I really did not know before. That man is, I suppose, emblematic of banking itself in the city of Kennett, or in this Kennett area, and has been for some years. I'm talking about our guest tonight is Mr. Joe Welman. He's now retired, but he's been past president of the Bank of Kennett. He's been chairman of the board, and past president of the American Bankers Association and the Missouri Bankers Association. So from someone who has known banking, I suppose, from the ground floor and has been in it for a great number of years, seen a great number of changes, I can't think of anyone, Mr. Welman, that could probably speak more for banking in this area than you. And I know you would deny that if, but in conversation with you earlier, you indicated that really I think yours is the story of this, how great our country is. You were talking to me about when you began as a very young man, I believe while still in high school, were you not?
That's right.
How old were you when you began?
I was, well, when I started to work for the Bank of Kennett, I was 17. But I had worked prior to that time in a bank at Bragg City, Missouri.
All right, now see, this was amazing to me that there was a bank in Bragg City. What was the name of the bank?
Bragg City Bank.
Oh, well, all right, that's very logical. And how old were you when you began that?
Oh, I worked there 2 summers, all of one summer and part of another. And then a part of a few months after I graduated from high school, before I came back to Kennett and worked for the Bank of Kennett. And I guess I was about 15.
All right, now what did you do in the bank at Bragg City?
Well, I did a little bit of everything. I was a janitor and tried to post the books and occasionally waited on people. Didn't always know exactly what I was doing, but I worked for some good men, and they helped me along and smoothed the way. One of them was Landreth Mackey, who came from Kennett, lived here a long time ago.
All right, now you lived in Kennett and went to school in Kennett.
That's right.
But you would travel to Bragg. Now, how did you get to Bragg City?
I went there on the train most of the time. I had no car, and if I could get a ride with somebody and the weather was right, why, I'd ride in a car, but only if I could bum a ride. And
now, what years are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about when I first came over to Bragg City, it was about 1920, 21, I guess, and that was prior to my banking experience. My uncle and my father and one of his brothers had a lumber mill over there, and I was working for them when I was about 14 in the summertime. So my first summer over there was working with them in the woods, and the mill was out north of town about 3 miles, and had to ride a horse out there. So my job was to take care of the horse and get out there and scale lumber. You know what scale lumber is?
Is that taking the bark off?
No.
All right. See, that sounds
scale logs and scale lumber. That's measuring
okay,
it to see how
right.
many feet's in it.
All right, sounds like
I lost that job after a few weeks because my uncle discovered that I was scaling from outside of the bark to outside of the bark on the logs we were buying.
Oh.
And I was supposed to scale from the inside of the bark to the inside of the bark. So I was measuring, giving them 2 good measure.
So you lost that job. Now, when you went into the banking in Bragg City, now, was it common for every little place to have a bank in those days?
Well, pretty much. There were many, many banks. And Bragg City had one. And
how many in the county, about, at that period?
Well, Bragg City, of course, isn't in this county. It's in Pemscott.
Right.
But in this county, we had... I was told we had 19 banks from memory as we talked about it. I can only recall by name 17 banks, but I suppose there was another one or two there that I can't recall the names of. But we did have 17 banks to my own knowledge in this county at one time.
Did every place like Holcomb and Arbor and Cardwell all
This
had
town had banks, and usually two if the town was any size. There were two in Cardwell, two in Hornersville, and two in Zenith, three in Kennett, one in Arbor, two in Holcomb, and there was one in Clarkton that I can recall, and there may have been two. There were two in Campbell and two in Malden. And the time that I'm recalling these banks, they were all small, and they were scattered. Every crossroad almost had a bank.
Now, you mentioned that you rode by railroad to Bragg City to work. Was the passenger travel, was there quite a bit
sure.
of that?
It was quite a thing then.
We
had a railroad coming in here, and we even had a sleeper. We could go to St. Louis if you had the money. And you get on the train down here at this railroad station, this little station we have down there now, or I guess it's been torn down, and go to sleep if you liked, and then the train would hook on later at night, take you over to Hayti and take you to St. Louis, and then bring you back. And when you got off in the mornings, why you be right here at home.
All right, so this was great, and but you were able to get right every now and then by car. The road, what was the shape of the road from here to Bragg City?
It was a dirt road and wooden bridges out here over the floodways, and the ditch dumps were real steep, and if you started down one of them, you just slid onto the bridge, and if you were lucky enough, you stayed on the bridge and got on to Kennett. My first experience was bringing the horses over here to be shod. The horses we'd ride up to the mill, and I'd ride over to Kennett and lead a couple of horses and have them shod, and then go back again. It was a long ride and took a long time. But then later, somebody got a car, and we'd come over in a car. When occasionally it'd get stuck, sometimes it'd quit. If it rained hard enough, couldn't get back. Sometimes I have to leave the car at Kennett and wait for the next day for the train. Go back on the train. I think it cost about 30 cents.
I was wondering what the fare would be.
I think it was 30 cents, but I'm not sure about that.
That was probably high.
Well, pretty high, yeah.
30 cents.
30 cents was 30 cents.
All right. Now, when you, from Bragg City, how did you make the change back to Kennett, working here in Kennett for the Bank of Kennett?
Well, I had worked previously here, and I don't think I told you that I'd worked here in Kennett my first year in high school. Here in Kennett, and for the St. Louis, Kennett, and Southeastern Railroad, which you probably don't remember either.
No.
But it's right where Bill Jones has his oil company now, and Jack Henderson has a filling station. That was a depot. And I was a roustabout there for the railroad, and got to working for W.D. Lasswell, a real old-timer here in Kennett, and he was president of the railroad. Russell Pankey was vice president. And I worked for them. My title was assistant to the president.
Boy.
But I didn't do anything. I'd get a pass, and they'd have assistant to the president on it. I'd get a pass to ride to St. Louis for nothing on the Frisco. And every time the conductor would always challenge this pass. I was about 15, 16 years old, and I had this pass as assistant to the president, and I always had to explain how I got that pass. But I did get free ride every once in a while. All
right, that's great to look back on those.
And that was my first job here. And then how I got back to Kennett from Bragg City, I was working over there. Mr. Lasswell Dan had told Mr. Shelton, who was looking for a stenographer, Frank Shelton. And they were good friends, and he said to him, well, boy, he used to work for me. He's now over at Bragg City, and you're looking for a stenographer, well, he'd be good for you. And then he called me and said, Mr. Shelton wanted to see me, and I came over on Sunday and talked to him a few minutes, and he hired me, and that's how I got here.
Now, where was the Bank of Kennett in its earliest years?
Well, in its very earliest years, that I don't remember, of course, and really don't have any record of, actually the bank burned about 1890, and in its first year or so, 1891, And they lost most of their records in that first year, but it was right about where the post office was at first. I never knew anything about that and don't have any pictures or records, but when I first became acquainted with it and where I went to work was on the north side of the square, where James Conn Department Store.
And I believe we have. I believe we have a picture at this point. James Conn Department Store in the eastern part of the store.
That's correct. They have the Easter room.
And this is, I have a picture here from an old brochure when they had the, what, the 50th?
50th anniversary.
50th anniversary of the Bank of Kennett.
1940.
I believe this is where the dry goods department is now.
That's correct. Has a different front on it.
Right, has a different front. Now, they moved in then to this present place that the bank is. In what year? What year did they move into this building?
They bought that in 1928 and moved in there in a combination. Part of the years 28 and 29.
Now, was it a bank at that time?
Yes, this bank was formerly a Citizen Savings Bank, and it closed, and then Mr. Shelton bought the building, and Bank Kennett moved over there a couple of years later. It closed in 1926.
All right, now I have one more picture here that I'd like to hold up. This is, describe this a little bit. Is this picture's before your day, is it not, inside the Bank of Kennett?
Yes, that picture is, I don't know the exact date, but it's way back, and it was considerably prior to my day. It must have been in the teens, 1918, 19, or something of that sort. The bank looked very much like that when I went to work for it, but not quite. It's somewhat older than when I
believe you mentioned there's mosaic tile on the floor, which was really an elegant structure. I like that spittoon, too.
That spittoon's gold looking. I don't know if it was gold or not, but it looked like gold, and some of our old-timers could have hit that pretty well.
All right, now, the bars on the window over the teller's cages, or what do you call this? How come they felt like at this point probably there was not nearly as much money handled as there is today, and yet there are no bars? Why the difference, I wonder?
Well, that evolution took place over a period of years, and we started out with bars and what looked to me like chicken wire and everything else up over the counters to keep people from robbing them. We didn't have any robberies, but this was supposed to make it a little bit harder to rob. And then down through the years, they decided that open windows looked more friendly and that sort of thing. And then eventually robberies got bad again. Now they got pictures, or got machines and cameras, and take a picture of the robber, and also alarms and markers to show how tall the person is and all that sort of thing. So we've swung back now to where, if you notice in the Memphis papers, it looks like they have a robbery about every day down there.
You mentioned, and we have just a moment, you mentioned your job, and you came to work for the Bank of Kennett, and then you rose quite rapidly in the ranks. What about the circumstances that prompted that?
Well, much of that was accidental, or if it wasn't accidental, it was just a series of circumstances that were unusual. I came to work there as a stenographer for Mr. Shelton, but we only had 4 people working there, and Charlie Hunter, Russell Panke, Geraldine Stout, and Mr. Shelton were the force when I went to work there, those 4 people. And I was the 5th one, so when somebody gets sick or was away, they'd have me fill in, and I learned most of the banking business by filling in for somebody else. And then we moved over to the other building, and I continued to correspond with Mr. Shelton after he became ill. He became fatally ill in the summer of 1929, and he died in December of 1929. And he'd been actually running the bank by correspondence from his hospital room in St. Louis. And I would transmit the messages and do what he said, and then I would write him back as to what had happened. And after he died, the search began for somebody to succeed him. He was both president and cashier, so he was the whole works.
So they settled on you, and what was your title at that time?
I was a cashier, and I was supposed to be operating. Mr. Lee Shelton, Mr. Frank Shelton's brother, became president. But he was inactive and didn't have any active part in the bank, except a director. And I became cashier, and sort of sink or swim proposition. I knew a little bit more about it than the other people who hadn't had the benefit of the contacts I'd had with Mr. Shelton, daily contacts. And I was just an accident and should not have been made cashier. But I didn't know any better, and apparently they didn't know any better either, and we somehow or other, the Lord helped us through it.
All right, Mr. Welman, we're out of time, but I have many questions that I want to ask you. I wanted to hit those Depression years, and time has not permitted. Can you come back and let's talk a little bit about those Depression years?
Sure.
Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Each evening, Monday through Friday at this time, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is brought to you through the cooperation of Kennett Cablevision Incorporated and is produced through the facilities of the Slicer Street Church. The Holy Scriptures come alive. Coming up next, stay tuned.